Hi, my name is BFarley, and we are going to be discussing an overview of verbal behavior and current issues. First, let's start where verbal behavior got its initial start with Skinner and his book, Verbal Behavior. In his book, his first initial definition is that verbal behavior is behavior reinforced through the mediation of other persons. And then later on in his book, he kind of redefines that behavior or that definition. He redefines verbal behavior and extends the definition to state where the listener must be responding in ways which have been conditioned precisely in order to reinforce the behavior of the speaker. So this is the technical terminology with verbal behavior and the technical definition. So let's look at some defining features of verbal behavior. And the behavior is established and maintained by reinforcement. Reinforcement's mediated by another person, and the other person's reinforcing behavior needs to be specifically trained to reinforce the speakers. So since we looked at what verbal behavior was, let's look at what some nonverbal behavior characteristics and responses would be. So this verbal behavior does not include automatic responses such as salivation, and self-reinforced behaviors. And then some irrelevant features would be topography, so what muscles are used to make the response, dynamics and characteristics, the speed, intensity, or repetition of the response, if the stimulus is verbal or nonverbal, the mode of the stimulus, so if it's auditory or visual, and the features of the reinforcement. So here is a visual analysis of operant behavior. So operant behavior is controlled by consequences. It can include both human and animal behavior. This comes from the operant conditioning. If you remember back to Skinner and the Skinner box and getting the rat to press the lever, and then the verbal operant. And the elementary verbal operants would be man, tact, echoic, interverbal, copy of text, textual, and transcription. So let's look at a mand. A mand is a verbal response in which the form of response is controlled by an establishing operation. This can be a demand, command, or reprimand. And then an example of this would be that there's no water available and that the speaker is thirsty and they state, "I want water," and then water is provided. The importance of a mand would be it's the first type of verbal behavior acquired by typical children. It can help control the social environment. It helps communicate the wants and needs. And a side effect can be that if it's neglected, it can impair language development. A tact is a response evoked by nonverbal discriminative stimulus and followed by generalized conditioned reinforcement. So the example would be that a child sees a ball and says ball, and then they're reinforced by the listener saying, "Yeah, you're right, that is a ball." And then the importance of a tact is that it allows the speaker to identify features of the physical environment. An echoic is a response that's evoked by a verbal discriminative stimulus that has point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity with the response. So an example of this would be that an adult says ball and then the child repeats ball, and they are reinforced by saying, "Yeah, you're right, ball." And the importance of this is the ability to repeat word is essential to acquiring the other elementary verbal operants. However, it can lead to echolalia, and then it also includes motor imitation and copy of text. Next, we look at interverbal, which is a response that's evoked by a verbal discriminative stimulus that does not have point-to-point correspondence with the verbal stimulus. And an example of this would be that the speaker says 1, 2, and the child says 3 to fill in the blank. and they are reinforced by the speaker saying, yeah, you're right, 1, 2, 3. And then the importance of an interverbal would be that it allows the speaker to identify features of the physical environment. It prepares a speaker to have behavior rapidly and accurately with respect to verbal stimulation and plays an important role in continuing a conversation. An interverbal repertoire also allows the speaker to answer questions and talk about objects and events that are not physically present. Interverbal behavior is a critical part of many important aspects of human behavior. It helps with social interactions, increases intellectual behavior, memory, thinking, problem solving, creativity, and academic behavior. Then we have copy of text, which is a response that's evoked by a verbal discriminative stimulus that has point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity with the response. An example would be that the written word is dog on the whiteboard, and then the child writes dog, and they're reinforced by getting an answer correct or stating, yes, you're right, you did write dog. An importance of this is that it's similar to an echoic, and learning to copy words also facilitates reading and writing. Next is textual, and textual is a response evoked by a verbal discriminative stimulus that has point-to-point correspondence between the stimulus and the response, but does not have formal similarity. So an example would be that the written word dog is presented and the child emits a verbal response, dog, and they're reinforced by saying, yes, you're right, you read dog. And last, we have transcription, which is a spoken verbal stimulus that evokes a written, typed, or finger-spelled response, and there is point-to-point correspondence, but no formal similarity between the stimulus and the response. So an example would be that the speaker says dog, and then the child writes D-O-G, and they're rewarded by a verbal, yes, you're right, and a correct answer. So now that we've discussed the elementary verbal operants, we're going to talk about verbal extensions. So Skinner distinguished between 4 types of extended tags, which are generic, metaphoric, metonymic, and solistic. So a generic extension is the novel stimulus shares all the relevant or defining features of the original stimulus. A metaphorical extension is that a novel stimulus shares some, but not all, of the relevant features of the original stimulus. Metonymical extension is that it involves a response to a novel stimuli that have none of the relevant features of the original stimulus configuration, but some irrelevant related feature has acquired the stimulus. And then the solistic extension occurs when the property that gains control of the response is only distantly related to the defining properties upon the standard reinforcements are contingent or similar to that property of the relevant stimulus. So next is faulty stimulus control. I'm sorry, we skipped a slide, so we're just going to go back a slide and discuss multiple control. So, this is a table that explains the multiple control, the convergent and divergent control. In a convergent multiple control, there's control of a single response by more than one variable. So in this example, the motivation for the bottle, a man holding up a bottle as attacked and stating, "Are you hungry?" The response is "Baba" by an infant for all 3 of those. And then on the divergent multiple control, strengthening of more than one response by a single variable. So the infant states "Baba," and the response given is by this listener is "just wait," or they're given the bottle, or they're asked "where did it go?" Next, we'll discuss faulty stimulus control. And so in faulty stimulus control, it occurs across verbal operants when the control of a behavior response occurs in the presence of irrelevant stimuli. And here we have examples of faulty stimulus control for a man, tact, and echoic. So in a man, when a child is on the playground and says slide with no MO for the slide, when the child is on the playground and with no slide and says slide, and then when a child's outside, not on the playground, and still says slide. For a tact, a child learns to tact his mom, and now any female he sees he calls mom. A child learns to tact his mom, and now any person, male or female, he sees he calls mom. And a child learns to tact his mom and now tacts anything that walks, animals or humans, as mom. And then echoic is when a speaker states eat and the response is apple. And when the speaker states apple, the listener provides no response. The echoic apple is under the irrelevant stimulus eat, but not under the stimulus control of the apple. Next, we'll discuss relational frame theories. So this comes as kind of an alternative and a build upon Skinner's definition of verbal behavior. So some defining elements of relational frame is that mutual entailment, so it's bidirectional between the stimuli, combinatorial entailment, which is mutual combination of two or more stimulus, and transformation of stimulus function is transforming or changing the function of stimulus based on how it is related to other stimuli. And then here we have an example of how this would work within an algebra class. So the types of relational frames, or the families of relational frames, are coordination, comparison, temporal, distinct, spatial, causal, opposition, hierarchical, and deidetic. So the coordination is the equivalence or the sameness. Then comparison is qualitative, quantitative relations. Temporal are relations of comparison along dimensions of time. Distinct are relations of different distinctions. Spatial are relations dealing with arrangement of objects in space. Causal are relations, specifically cause and effect or conditionality. Opposition are relations of opposition. Hierarchical are relations of comparison along the dimension of the hierarchical class membership. And then deidetic relations are specified in terms of perspective of the speaker. So a temporal example would be breakfast comes after supper and before lunch, lunch comes after breakfast and before supper, and supper comes after lunch and before breakfast. Another important aspect when discussing relational frames is to understand arbitrary and non-arbitrary responses. So arbitrary responses are contextual, and however, just because it's arbitrarily applicable does not mean it's arbitrarily applied. So the example is in algebra class, x equals y. So this is an arbitrary response in algebra class. However, when you go out into the world outside of algebra or the specific question, x equals y is not a strong response, or there's no understanding of what x equals y is. So this would be not able to be applied. And then a non-arbitrary response refers to those relational responses based on physical characteristics. So an example of this would be while sitting in geometry class, a triangle has 3 sides. So this is applicable outside of the geometry class because that physical distinction of a triangle has 3 sides is always related to the definition of what a triangle is. So after relational frame theory, we now are going to talk about naming. So naming is defined as generalized operant that combines speaker and listener behaviors within the individual. Naming is the involvement of a bidirectional relation, similar to relational frame theory, and naming is present in the child-caregiver relationship, with one member evoking a tact, and this in turn evokes the listener behavior. So an example would be a child asks, "What is this?" when a cup is held up. The child then responds with a cup and asks for his own. Then the listener responds with, "Get another cup," and the child's able to go to the cupboard and obtain a cup. So a non-example of naming would be a child asks, "What is this?" when a cup is held up. The child then responds cup and is provided with a Skittle. Another time the child is asked, "What is this?" when a cup is held up, and the child then responds cup, then is told to get a cup, and the child responds cup. So there's no bidirectional relationship in the non-example that is present in the example. So after naming, we are going to discuss stimulus equivalence. So equivalence relations allow for the experimental study of a type of stimulus generalization. This is reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity are defined within the stimulus equivalence, and mastery of all three of these forms a stimulus class. So an example of reflexivity is a picture of a cup equals a picture of a cup. Symmetry is a picture of a cup equals the verbal cup. So then that also means that the verbal cup will evoke the response of the picture of the cup. And so transitivity is when a picture of a cup equals the verbal cup, and then the verbal cup also equals the textual CUP. Then the non-trained response is the picture of a cup and the textual CUP. So there's been that stimulus generalization with the emergent of relations between the picture and the textual that was not initially trained. And this is when the stimulus equivalence occurs and an equivalence class is formed. So let's discuss some of the current theoretical issues that are present in verbal behavior. So in the beginning of his book, Verbal Behavior, Skinner's definition of verbal behavior is described as needing refinement, and later in the book, he does make provisions to the initial definition. So in the beginning, Skinner's definition of verbal behavior was behavior reinforced through the mediation of other persons. But later, a further explanation was provided stating where the listener must be responding in ways which have been conditioned precisely in order to reinforce the behavior of the speaker. So reading this definition, there needs to be that listener-speaker relationship in order for what Skinner thinks verbal behavior to occur. This can create a number of critiques. The listener plays a large role in verbal behavior of the speaker. There needs to be a previous history of reinforcement. Conditioning needs to be precise, and others, and then we'll discuss some others that are brought up. So in critiquing Skinner's definition of verbal behavior, the emergent and growing field of stimulus equivalence phenomenon needs attention. When stimulus equivalent matching to sample with arbitrary stimuli is used, individuals are learning relations between pre-designated arbitrary stimulus members within a set. So they're trained for A equals B, A equals C, and they're emerging relations of B equals C because A equals B and A equals C. So the initial sets are trained, additional relations of emergence occurs. So this is contradictory to Skinner's definition because the emerged relationships were never previously conditioned or reinforced. In relational frame theory, there's the incorporation of stimulus equivalence training such as coordination and is proposed as an alternative to Skinner's verbal behavior definition. In relational frame theory, relational frames or derived relations involve arbitrary stimuli But these stimuli are regarded as varieties of relational operands and are produced by an individual's previous interaction between their behavior and the social and non-social environment. So Hayes suggests that, contradictory to Skinner's, verbal behavior is any behavior that involves arbitrarily applicable relational responding. So in my opinion, the new definition of verbal behavior does not leave room for error. As behavior analysts, it's important for us to understand human error when identifying master of specific behavior. So Skinner does not leave room for error. He has more of a black and white definition of verbal behavior. However, if we look at the other side of the argument, if a toddler is sitting in his crib babbling, but there is no listener present to reinforce this behavior, and is he not engaging in verbal behavior? Through relational frame theory, the definition of verbal behavior allows for this example to be labeled as verbal behavior. So relational frame theory defines verbal behavior by the interaction with the social and non-social environment. So the toddler is babbling. There's nobody present to reinforce it, so there's that lack of the social reinforcement. But through RFT, we can define that as verbal behavior because it's also the interaction with the non-social environment. This is not saying that RFT is perfect. There are definitely flaws. So Palmer reviews RFT, and within the review, the question is presented: is a relational frame a class of behavior, or is the history that produced that class of behavior? The confusion is the flaw in RFT. So relational frames are formed based on interactions with the environment, but what training occurs to ensure that those relations are socially relevant? Skinner's verbal behavior may not have room for error, but this definition is more operational than that of RFT. So through research, Skinner built the foundation of research for verbal behavior. He produced not only a productive research program, but also a strong foundation for other verbal behavior theories. Recently, the area of verbal behavior has expanded into areas such as those described with stimulus equivalence, relational frame theory, and naming. And even though there has been an increase in verbal behavior studies, there is still room for improvement. As ABA is a growing field, there is a need for additional and more research in the field of verbal behavior. Just because Skinner has a set definition does not mean that if he were here today to change or to alter his definition, that wouldn't happen. So it's important to remember that Skinner's definition of verbal behavior was set in, his book was published in 1957, and it is now 2016. So as the field grows, research needs to continue. Here are my references, and if you have any questions or correspondence, please email me at bfarley@ego.thechicagoschool.edu. Thank you.